Today, I will tell you a new exciting story.
Today, we will revisit one of the most mysterious and terrifying criminals in U.S. history, the Golden State Killer. His crimes went unpunished for decades, but thanks to new technologies, especially DNA testing, his identity was finally uncovered. We'll dive into the chilling story of his crimes and discover how years of investigation and modern technology led to the resolution of this case. The Golden State Killer, also known as the East Area Rapist, the Diamond Knot Killer, the Visalia Ransacker, and the original Night Stalker, remained unknown for many years. He was finally named the Golden State Killer after true crime author Michelle McNamara gave him this moniker. Initially, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker. When in 1974, reports began coming in about a mysterious figure burglarizing homes in the small farm town of Visalia, California. He would sometimes steal only small keepsakes like coins, rings, and jewelry, leaving more valuable items untouched. He also took firearms and tools, which made investigators suspect he was gravitating toward violence. Investigators noticed that the intruder would enter homes through windows and doors, leaving additional escape routes in case he was interrupted. His crimes grew bolder and more dangerous. He also left behind distinctive shoe prints, which contributed to the development of a more detailed description. On September 11, 1975, his violence escalated when he killed Claude Snelling, who was trying to protect his daughter from being abducted. This murder became a turning point, as the weapon used was one that had been stolen in one of his previous burglaries. Descriptions from Snelling's daughter and other witnesses helped paint a clearer picture of the perpetrator. Later that year, he struck again in Visalia, and the police began intensifying their search with nighttime patrols in areas where the prowler had previously been seen. He remained elusive, but his actions became increasingly bold and reckless. The police had been struggling to track down the Visalia Ransacker for quite some time. His crimes were meticulously planned, and he always managed to evade capture. The combination of his skill in evading the authorities and his disturbing modus operandi made him a particularly challenging case. Despite multiple attempts to catch him, his attacks continued throughout the area. He would target single women or those with small children, often breaking into homes late at night. His careful planning made him nearly impossible to pin down, but his pattern of behavior became clearer with each attack. Officer McGowan, who was integral to the investigation, noted that the suspect seemed to have a specific method for avoiding identification. He was careful not to leave any trace of his presence beyond the bare minimum, which made tracing his movements nearly impossible. The case took a significant turn when Officer McGowan himself became a victim of the Visalia Ransacker. The attacker had shot a projectile that struck McGowan's flashlight, a powerful metal flashlight that had been in use by the officer. The projectile pierced through several batteries and lodged itself deep within the flashlight. Despite the attack, McGowan remained determined to continue his work on the case. In a later statement, he shared how the Visalia Ransacker had eluded police that night, even though the entire police force had been tracking his prints and using police dogs to catch him. After the attack, McGowan added important details to the description of the suspect, including that the ransacker drew his weapon and shot with his left hand. He worked closely with a sketch artist to create detailed images of the suspect, which would later play a key role in the investigation. Even after retiring from the Visalia Police Department, McGowan stayed committed to the investigation. His relentless pursuit of the truth continued well into his retirement. When he passed away, his son took up the cause and continued his work. The investigation into the Visalia ransackers' crimes became the most costly in the city's history. Over the years, the ransackers' crimes included 1 murder, 1 attempted kidnapping, 1 attempted murder, and over 100 burglaries. Police soon began to suspect that the same man might be behind a series of burglaries in Exeter, California, dating back to 1968. These burglaries were associated with the spree of robberies, dubbed the Cordova Cat Burglar. Although there was no direct evidence linking the Visalia ransacker to these crimes, the similarities in his methods left investigators with little doubt that he was responsible for both. In the 1970s, a time when dedicated departments for sex crimes were not yet common, and before criminal profiling terms like signature behaviors and rituals had been coined, investigators relied on patterns to distinguish offenders. Jane's attack was no exception. Like the previous attacks, the assailant cut her only on the shoulder, which led the police to believe he was suppressing an urge to inflict more pain. But after Jane's assault, the ransacker began to escalate. He started clicking scissors and threatening to cut off victims' toes. He would stab the bed next to them, using psychological torment as his new signature. One of his most disturbing behaviors was the use of the victims' names, mentioning personal details like their high school, making them believe that he knew them. He would stand silently for hours, making the victims believe he had left before giving away his position with a noise, revealing he was still there. Descriptions of him were always consistent. A white male, about 5 feet 9 inches, in his late teens or early 20s, with an athletic build. His movements were described as deliberate and quiet, a stark contrast to his hurried speech. He had a peculiar habit of draping towels over TVs or lamps, and he always seemed to need lighting just so. The ransacker had particular psychosexual needs. He would bind his victims multiple times with various materials, but never fondled them. During the assaults, he would question them, as he did with Jane. "Is this like the captain's?" he asked her while raping her, his tone cold and dismissive. At times, he would snap at them, directing them with sharp commands like, "Put some emotion into that," threatening, "or I'll use my knife." It was clear to the police that they were dealing with someone different, someone who was not only methodical, but also disturbingly familiar with police tactics. This was no ordinary rapist. After the attack in Carmichael, a town hall meeting was held on November 3, 1976, to address the growing concern over the serial attacks. The room was packed with around 500 people, and the local newspaper, the Sacramento Bee, published an article the following day outlining the 8 attacks up to that point. Detectives were forced to awkwardly field questions, offering little in terms of new information and urging the public to remain vigilant. Law enforcement had never anticipated such a large turnout, nor had they expected the East Area rapist to begin targeting couples. Just one day later, a 13-year-old girl from Walnut Creek was raped in her own home. Police were unable to determine how the assailant gained entry, but they knew that the girl had been bound and assaulted in her own residence. Her father and older sister, who were inside the house at the time, had no idea what had transpired. As time went on, the East Area Rapists' tactics became increasingly brazen and unsettling. A 1977 article in the Sacramento Bee warned single women to be on alert, stating that the rapist would never attack when a man was present in the home. Almost as if to challenge this, the ransacker began to target couples. He adapted, read the news, and adjusted his methods accordingly. If an article described him as pale, his next attacks would feature a more tanned man. His hair would go from long to short, and his attacks on couples marked an escalation. He started binding the men, forcing the women to bind them while he separated the two. He would force the man to kneel and stack teacups and saucers on his back, threatening to kill the woman if they rattled. The attacks were eerily similar. Tight bindings that left bruises, food and beer cans scattered around, and the distinct feeling that the assailant was taking his time. He would ransack homes, stealing jewelry, coins, and other trivial items. Nothing of real value, but enough to keep the police guessing. At one point, the assailant even told one of his victims that he had been in the army. This led investigators to theorize that the man might have military training. There were several military bases around Sacramento, and many of his victims described him as having the demeanor of someone with a background in the armed forces. The police began to focus their efforts on tracking down the East Area rapist, but he was always one step ahead. They placed cameras in neighborhoods they suspected he might target, but he evaded them. The police had no idea where he would strike next, and he seemed to know the exact locations of their patrols. In one instance, he even shouted at a victim to freeze as she tried to reach for a phone. The community, feeling increasingly helpless, installed floodlights and participated in neighborhood watch programs. People began to sleep in shifts, but the attacks continued. Then, on May 17, 1977, a significant breakthrough occurred. Police were called to Carmichael after a man was seen standing on the side of the road with a shoelace dangling from his wrist. Officer Richard Shelby immediately recognized him as someone who had attended the town hall meeting 6 months earlier and had loudly spoken out about the East Area rapist. It seemed the ransacker had chosen this victim as a challenge. In the wake of the 42nd attack in Danville, investigators found a notebook that had been torn apart, containing strange writings about the author's anger towards a teacher and a hand-drawn map of a suburban neighborhood. Although the map did not lead to new leads, it revealed a strong understanding of architecture and landscape design. The police began looking into anyone with knowledge of construction or development in the area, hoping to find someone who had a reason to spend extended periods in the neighborhoods where the attacks occurred. Yet another chilling case begins with the murder of a young couple in their early 20s, which shook an already terrified community. A witness, looking out a window, described the killer: a man in a ski mask, a brown leather jacket, and dark shoes. At this point, the killer only committed murder out of necessity, killing when he felt there was no other option. His murders became more brutal, and he started threatening his victims, saying he would begin killing and wanted them to relay messages to the police, which he hoped to see in the papers the next morning. A summer break in 1978 marked a pause in the killer's activities. His last attack was in June, and people let out a sigh of relief. But their hopes were quickly dashed in October when the attacks resumed. This time, the crime spread south to San Jose and back to Rancho Cordova, then down to Walnut Creek. It seemed like he took summers off, following an academic calendar, and never attacked on holidays. One victim recalled waking up to a blinding flashlight in her face. At first, she thought it was her father, but then she saw a knife. He tied her hands behind her back, cut her over the eye, and ransacked the room, stealing money, jewelry, and personal items. Despite the shock, she lay still, terrified he might return. By late fall, the killer had started killing 2 to 3 victims a month. The city was gripped with fear. Gun sales surged, but many buyers were inexperienced with firearms, adding more danger to the situation. However, in the summer of 1979, he took another break, returning in the fall to Southern California, specifically to the Santa Barbara area. Initially, his crimes weren't linked to the East Area rapist, but later, DNA evidence confirmed the connection. By then, he was dubbed the original Night Stalker to distinguish him from another notorious killer. His attacks grew more brutal, and he threatened his victims with death while they barely escaped with their lives. In one case in Goleta, a couple woke up to a blinding flashlight. The man tied up the boyfriend, and the woman was forced to tie him. The intruder ransacked the house, threatening death. The woman managed to escape and alert neighbors, one of whom, an FBI agent, gave chase. The man was last seen fleeing on a stolen bike, and though the agent didn't fire, he was criticized for not reacting sooner. This marked the beginning of a horrifying series of attacks. By late 1979, the killer had moved to Ventura, where he brutally attacked a married couple. He used an unusual knot to bind his victims, earning the nickname Diamond Knot Killer. His killing spree continued into 1980, with more brutal attacks, and his victims were often tormented by haunting phone calls for years afterward. Survivors could hear his voice, and many believed he still lived nearby, free and alive.
Hello? Hello?
By the early 80s, his attacks became less frequent, though some speculated that either his crimes were not yet connected or his personal life was now hindering his ability to continue. In July 1981, 2 more victims, Sherry Domingo and Greg Sanchez, fell prey to him. Greg fought back fiercely, taking a gunshot to the cheek before being bludgeoned to death. This would be his last attack on a couple. In 2016, the FBI offered a $50,000 reward for any new leads that could lead to an arrest. This reignited interest in the case. Paul Holes and his team uploaded DNA from a victim's assault kit to a genealogical database called GED Match, which uses DNA submitted by individuals to build family trees. They identified 10 distant relatives, eventually narrowing it down to 2 suspects. One was eliminated, leaving Joseph James DeAngelo as their prime suspect. DeAngelo was not the person they initially thought. Born in 1945, he was much older than the age range they had been searching for. The suspect they had in mind was likely in his late teens during the Sacramento area attacks. But DeAngelo, at 31, was already a police officer when the crimes took place. Despite his age, his surveillance showed a man who appeared decades younger. But how did DeAngelo evade capture for over 40 years? Joseph DeAngelo was born into a turbulent household. His father, a violent World War II veteran, regularly abused his wife and children. As an adult, DeAngelo enlisted in the Navy and later attended college. He briefly engaged in a tumultuous relationship with a woman named Bonnie, whom he stalked after their breakup. In 1973, after completing his criminal justice degree, DeAngelo joined the Exeter Police Department. While there, a series of burglaries, later attributed to the Visalia ransacker, took place. His crimes escalated, and by 1976, when he joined the Auburn Police Department, he had already begun committing the infamous attacks that would define him as the East Area Rapist. In 1979, DeAngelo was caught stealing dog repellent and a hammer from a store. He was fired, but his crime spree was far from over. For years, DeAngelo led an unremarkable life, working as a mechanic in Roseville from 1990 until his retirement in 2017. He and his family lived together until his arrest in 2018. When arrested, DeAngelo showed little surprise. He calmly asked officers to turn off his oven, where a roast was cooking. His arrest signified the end of a long search for justice.
Hi, my name's Mary Bailey, and I live about 6 houses away from here, and my son has probably trick-or-treated at this house. The last 4 years we've lived in this neighborhood, so it's quite a shocker to see this happen in my hometown.
And I can tell you that over the last few days, as information started to point towards this individual, we started some surveillance. We were able to get some discarded DNA, and we were able to confirm what we thought we already knew, that we had our man. And yesterday afternoon, in a perfectly executed arrest, my detectives arrested James Joseph DeAngelo, 72 years old, living in Citrus Heights. I can tell you that although it was DNA, ultimately, that led us down the right road, there were a lot of places that road could have led. I don't want to I can't underscore enough the absolute human factor, the dogged determination of not only the detectives working on this case, but the passion of the district attorney, myself, the community, and the victims. All too often we forget about talking about the victims. And today we at least brought the first step towards closure for those victims of these horrendous crimes. So I want to thank not only the district attorney and the crime lab and the DNA that helped us get here, but my own detectives and the detectives from all of these folks represented by the leaders standing behind me. When we put together this working group 2 years ago and brought in the FBI, who was more than happy to be part of this team and effort, we had no way of knowing that we'd be standing here talking about the resolution of all of these crimes. So I have to thank them, and again underscore the importance of the human factor and the dogged determination and passion of the individuals and human beings that led us down the right road to this individual today.
All right, Your Honor, on the 130 calendar, page 2, in custody.
Joseph James DeAngelo, your true and correct legal name? 1124. There is no bail placed on you from the complaint filed April 25th, 2018, Subdivision C, Subdivision 5. You have a lawyer, Mr. DeAngelo. Can you afford one, or are you asking the court to appoint you a lawyer?
No, thank you, sir.
Okay, May 14th, 8:30, 61, Mr. DeAngelo.
Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He pled guilty to 76 charges in 2020 to avoid the death penalty. For decades, his identity remained hidden, but now the victims have their closure, and DeAngelo's life behind bars ensures that justice has been served. A life sentence is now all that remains for the man who evaded capture for so long. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Your likes and comments help us grow and create even more engaging content for you.